There is a day that won't soon be forgotten by people in Ottawa, the day a gunman stormed Parliament Hill, and that was identified by some as a defining moment in Ottawa this year. And that's what we're talking about in today's Sunday Scrum, Key Moments of 2014 in Politics. Joining me now, the CBC's Louise Elliott and freelance columnist Susan Riley in Ottawa, and Maclean's Montreal Bureau Chief Martin Patriquin. Hello to you all. So these, the Canadian press just sent out a release saying that, in fact, that moment, Louise, was the defining moment of the year, that attack on Parliament Hill. A survey of newspaper editors across the country seemed to agree. Not everyone does, but a lot do. Do you agree with that, Louise?
I do. This was really my pick for the year's defining moment, and there's a couple of reasons. The shooting itself, of course, was really spectacular. We had never seen anything like this on Parliament Hill, at least in my time here, and certainly for decades. So this was an unusual event and an upsetting event, but I think what also came out of it politically was highly significant. We've seen the parties respond in a way that, really they rose above politics, at least in the initial weeks following the shooting. And I think that it actually gave the Conservatives a bit of a game changer in terms of their position in the minds of Canadians. I think seeing Stephen Harper handle this crisis, and it really was a crisis, has obviously benefited the Conservative brand, it's benefited the party, and to a certain extent it's given the Prime Minister a boost, because really, I think when people see events like this, they want to feel secure. They want to feel that there's a steady, and in this case, experienced hand in charge. And I think that that also played a role in how this played out. Politically also, I think it gave the opposition a chance to distinguish itself in terms of reaction, in terms of how the event is being characterized. Was it terrorism? Was it a mental illness problem? I think there's valid arguments that it was both, but I think the opposition is trying, certainly the NDP is trying to qualify it in a way that the government is not.
And that's interesting because, Martin, you believe that as well, right? That there was an interesting way in which the parties and the leaders tried to characterize exactly what happened on that day.
Absolutely, and my knee-jerk reaction right after it happened, I said, in my head, I was like, the Conservatives are going to point out any differences in terms of policy coming into in the wake of this, and sort of saying, you were against the mission in ISIS, in Iraq against ISIS, so you're soft on terror, saying that to the Liberals and NDP. That actually didn't happen, and that was a very heartening moment, and it speaks a bit to that sort of going beyond partisan politics a little bit. That said, though, what can't happen in the wake of this is an erosion of personal freedoms for the sake of trying to prevent something else like this. If incidents like this, incidents in St. John, incidents even in Australia, most recently as we've seen, it's absolutely, or it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, to legislate against quote-unquote lone wolf attacks. I call them stray dog attacks, so as not to insult wolves. But it's precisely that they're so pernicious because you can't legislate again. And I hope that the government doesn't try to do that.
Susan, how important was this story for you?
In the Parliament Hill context, less important. Then I would say if you're looking for defining moments, I think the beheadings that we saw on television by ISIS were a defining moment in the sense that they were a galvanizing moment. Let's put it that way. And I do think one of the benefits, or one of the good side effects of the Parliament Hill shooting was the emotional empathy that we saw, the connection that we saw among the MPs. In fact, thinking back on this year, in some ways it's been a veil of tears. We've seen a lot of emotion from what is usually a rather dry and often very nasty environment. We saw, exactly. We saw, Paul Calandra and his tearful apology. We saw Dean Del Mastro melting down after the charges under the Election Act. Of course, Jim Flaherty's funeral elicited a lot of genuine empathy and support. And Flaherty himself, as you recall, broke down when he was talking about the difficulty that Rob Ford found himself in, which brings us to Doug Ford, who was also tearful. And I don't think any of this is a bad thing. I don't say it to make fun of them by any means. I think it's a reminder that these are human beings and they're dealing with I think it's quite, it's clarifying.
Louise,
I'm
let me-
about to cry. That was very
Oh,
nice,
yeah, that
actually.
was.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
We're all very tearful today. Louise, let me ask you, because we did bring up ISIS. So let's talk about Canada's role on the world stage and how the various leaders and the various parties defined some of those moments. What's your sense about that? I mean, I guess ISIS is a normal place to start.
Well, you know, we kind of scratched our heads a bit in the fall when we heard that the Prime Minister's, one of his big thrusts this fall would be to try to define himself more on the world stage. He hasn't really been somebody who enjoys that kind of role. Certainly in my experience on trips with him, diplomacy and the international, you know, sort of chit-chatting that happens is not his favorite thing to do. But actually, and we saw him head off to the UN this fall for the first time in quite a while to give a speech and appear before the Security Council, which he's shunned for several years. This was all part of a plan to present Stephen Harper as a real player on the world stage. And actually, as events began to happen, you know, the threat of ISIS, the homegrown terror threat, and I would also add Russia, you know, the conflict in the Ukraine as areas where the Prime Minister has appeared more, I would say stronger, I would say more prime ministerial, more leader-like. Certainly the interaction we heard about with Vladimir Putin, where he shook his hand but at the same time told him to get out of the Ukraine. These are all moments, I think, that the government has used to good effect. And of course, they have the incredible benefit of being the incumbents. So when you see a challenger, Justin Trudeau being right now at least the #1 challenger in the polls, he's tried to come close, but actually you can't compete with the fact that Stephen Harper is now probably one of the most long-standing leaders, if not the most, in the G8. He may have been, he may be the longest-serving leader in the G8 at the moment. So, or a close second, I can't remember. But bottom line here, he's got that benefit. Justin Trudeau has to, I think, up his game a little in this regard. His response to the ISIS threat and the decision to send in CF-18s sounded weak. It wasn't so much the decision to not support it that I had a problem with. It was the way it was framed. He didn't have a very valid explanation or a very clear explanation of why he chose not to.
Martin?
And also, and went the default Justin Trudeau route of making a completely inappropriate joke while you know, voicing his opposition to it. It was a total flunk on his part.
Susan, your sense of how each leader dealt with issues on the world stage, some of the important issues, ISIS, Russia, maybe the relationship with the United States over Keystone oil pipelines?
Yeah, I don't think that was such a triumph for the Prime Minister. In fact, I think that's one of the challenges that he's going to face. I mean, he's got to get this energy, oil, environment thing right. He's got to forget the truculence and forget the ideology and get with the program. And we saw signs that he was starting to in his year-end interview with Peter Mansbridge. He mused about Alberta's carbon levy. He was careful not to call it a tax, indicating that he might be moving in that direction. I wouldn't put too much store in it if I was an environmentalist, because I expect it's another delaying tactic of some description. Nonetheless, yeah, I don't think that was a success. I think Justin Trudeau does look weak. I noticed he's recently assembled a panel of foreign policy experts to advise him. To me, this is always a confession of weakness. You know, I mean, I know people who wish him well, who wish the Liberal Party well, who basically can't stand Stephen Harper. They're saying, all Justin needs is some advisor. He needs good advice. No, he's the leader. He needs to know what he's doing.
And yet, Martin, and then we have Tom Mulcair. Tom Mulcair scores very well when it says, you know, what would you think of him as a leader? What do you think of him as Prime Minister? He comes across strong in the House. Still no traction, I guess, still in Quebec. But what's your sense of what Tom Mulcair is facing?
Well, this discussion we're having is very edifying. This is the first time we're mentioning Tom Mulcair, and yet he's opposition leader. You know, he had a line, and I just have to read it. He was talking about the national media, and he said, you know, why do people always mention Justin Trudeau before Tom Mulcair? And he said, you know, a bit angrily, he said, write them a letter and give them bad word for having done that. You know, the frustration, I think, is getting to the party. I think a little bit Tom Mulcair has to get out of the Ottawa bubble. You know, he performs extremely well in Parliament Hill, as everybody else knows. He's an unknown quantity in a lot of part of the country, and he's got to get out and do that.
Martin, I think Tom Mulcair has got to get some policy, and he's got to get brave brave, and he's got to get brave on the environment and the thing we were talking about before, oil and energy. He's utterly confused on that score. He's being eclipsed by the Green Party. He's being eclipsed by Glenn Murray, who's the Liberal, provincial Liberal environment minister. Glenn Murray sounds way more progressive on the environment than Tom Mulcair does. And there's a constituency there. And I think they're losing it. The Liberals are wishy-washy on this. I think that, anyway.
I agree with you, but the problem is you have this classic area where the Liberals and the NDP are sort of going after the same mushy vote that isn't quite as progressive as anybody else on environment. And they're trying to get those votes. I mean, it's a classic political situation. And it goes into the other problem, of course, for the opposition parties. Harper's fomenting a vote split on the progressive side. That's like telegraphed, and anyway, we can talk about that.
Yeah, we will. We will talk about the leaders more in the second part. It's okay. We're jumping around. It's a Sunday morning. It's a nice conversation. It's great. But another important story, and I think you all agree with me on this, and it did come out of the Gomeshi story here at the CBC, and that is the harassment story on the Hill. Yeah. Louise, tell me about that, and what's the takeaway? And it's, I mean, we're not done with it, but what's the takeaway from that important story?
Well, this is a messy story. It's an unresolved story, but it's a highly significant story, and I think that's partly due to how the opposition has played it. I think Justin Trudeau comes out the winner on this. I think he appeared decisive, he appeared progressive, he appeared to believe these women, even though we don't know much about the reality of what happened. There's no process in place. Of course, it exposed all the problems with working on the Hill in a dinosaur-era series of lack of policy and just lack of regulations around this, lack of process. We've talked about that, but I think politically, if you want to go out to, the places off Parliament Hill and the rest of the country, the women's vote is a key driver for the Liberals. And when I say the women's vote, there's no one women's vote. They're after urban and suburban women, and especially Ontario. They are looking for people who will not vote Conservative. This gave Trudeau an edge, and I think it could prove to be a significant edge going into 2015, and for that reason, I think harassment and the firestorm it touched off on social media across the country, in fact, across the continent, if you look what's happening with Bill Cosby in the U.S., this is a big issue, and I think for once it could actually prove to be a vote-moving issue. I'm very interested in how this might actually affect voting in the 2015 election. We'll have to see.
All right. I want to get more of a sense from all of you on that, but I also want to move to the provincial realm, because this is what's interesting, and all of you have different big provincial stories of the year. So, Martin, let's start with you. What's the big provincial story?
Look, it's part of the joke about when a Liberal government gets elected with a solid majority in Quebec. Some of us can go to sleep for a little while because the news editors in Toronto are just like, oh, there's no separatism. Well, then talk to you in 2018. The big issue, though, of course, is Pierre Karl-Péladeau, because this certainly to news editors, they're like, well, all of a sudden the separatist monster is back. He has doubled down on the issue of sovereignty, in part because he had to. I think there was a lot of sort of area to capture within the PQ. Bring back the idea, bring back the flame, et cetera, et cetera. And he's the guy that put his fist up in the air and arguably hamstrung the PQ campaign during the election, has come back and has doubled down on that. What that tells me is that we're in for the same sort of old rhetoric that we've seen for decades now, and it's a bit tiresome for me, but people outside my realm quite like it.
It's all fresh to us, Marty.
It's all fresh to everyone else, except I've seen it a million times. So
you've seen that movie too many times. Susan, for you, I think it's Premier Wynne, right? And her relationship with Harper?
Yes, but I'm going to just step back for a minute and say that, yes, I'm going to say, here's what I noticed. The emergence of a lot of strong personalities across the provincial scene doing very surprising things against a backdrop of a bunch of overfamiliar Grinches on Parliament Hill that a lot of people are fed up with. There's a federal vacuum on the policy level and on the personality level. We have Christy Clark winning when she wasn't supposed to. We have Alison Redford self-destructing when she wasn't expected to. We have Wynne, yes, a lesbian runner, the Premier of Ontario. And I think, the de facto leader of progressive forces in the country right now. We've got the Péladeau incident and Couillard and this very young Brian Gallant in I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Brian Gallant. In New Brunswick.
New Brunswick, yeah.
So anyway, just a bunch of really interesting new players.
All right, and now Louise, I know, and I think I may agree with you, Louise, on this one because this is an incredible one, and it's a story that just broke the other day. And this was the Wild Rose defection. Tell me about why you think that's important.
This may be why I chose it, because it's most recent in my memory. But I have to say, Danielle Smith leading 6 of her, merry band of Wild Rosers over to sit with Jim Prentice only a week or 2 after she condemned one of her own party members for doing that.
Pretty amazing.
What does this mean? This means that Alberta is now more than ever a one-party province, because although we, of course, have the Liberals and the NDP there, they really don't register. So,
hasn't it been a one-party province for about 80 years?
Yes, but now, the Wild Rose did challenge the government. There was a sense of challenge there. There was a sense that they would, push the party, sure, further to the right, but at least there was somebody holding the Premier's feet to the fire. So the spectacular fall of Alison Redford has to be mentioned too, because that was a bit of a shocker. I don't think any one of us predicted that. The fact that she won the election when Danielle Smith was being predicted as the winner was a shocker. Then we see Danielle Smith doing something that, we just can't fathom. And it really does give Jim Prentice a somewhat awkward caucus. I think a lot of his caucus members are scratching their heads and wondering, can we trust these people to be part of our caucus? So all in all, that to me was just a spectacular story, as only Alberta can deliver. And you have to ask, what are those poor Wild Rosers who are still left as the Wild Rose thinking?
And this is the point that I would pick up on, is that Wild Rose was disgruntled establishment Tories and a few crazies. Yeah. Let's be honest. This gets rid of this sort of carves off the establishment Tories from the crazies, exactly. Yeah. And so it's for that reason, though. I honestly think that Danielle Smith, this is consequence free for her. I think it's the most cynical move in the world, but I think she's going to win again. I don't think it'll affect her at all in 2016.
Oh, interesting. All right. Well, coming up next, the challenges for 2015. Maybe there's some Grinches, maybe some merry men, maybe some merry women out there. We'll talk about what each of the leaders from the top parties have to worry about in the year to come. An election year, no less. The Sunday Scrum returns in a moment. We're back with round 2 of the Sunday Scrum, a look at key moments in politics this year and now what to look for next year. Louise Elliott and Susan Riley are in Ottawa. Martin Patriquin is in Montreal. All right, maybe we could call this section Who's Been Naughty and Who's Been Nice in the spirit of the holidays. And we touched on it a little bit about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the various leaders. But let's start, Louise, with what maybe the Prime Minister needs to work on based on this year going into an election year.
Well, politically speaking, I think he needs to carry on the momentum he's actually generated in the last month or so. That's his political challenge. The problem he faces right now is the falling price of oil. If that oil price stays low or, just stays in this historic slump, he's going to have to relook at his books. He's going to have to relook at his budgetary promise to balance the books and deliver on all these tax cut goodies in time for the next election. And that's a huge challenge for the Prime Minister that he needs to address, especially if oil doesn't recover in the early new year. It could really affect the Canadian economy. And this has been the Prime Minister who's relied on the idea of a burgeoning economy. The only other piece of that I'll mention quickly is that in terms of his plan for Canada being an energy superpower, and we've already seen him start to temper his language and talk a tiny bit about possible carbon emission offsets. If he doesn't do that, he's going to be putting all his eggs in that oil basket, and right now that basket's not looking so good. So he's got that challenge for
Susan?
sure.
About Harper?
Yeah.
I'm sure they're writing all this down, too, because you know how much they follow our advice. I don't think it matters what we say. I think he's going to do what he's going to do, and he will be potentially unfooted or weakened further by more corruption / personality scandals involving his cabinet that we cannot predict.
Interesting. All right, Martin?
Very quickly, I think that the child care, the checks that are going to start flowing out in this summer, child care and tax cuts, et cetera, I think that's hell or high water territory. That's going to happen regardless of the price of oil. I think that's part and parcel of the government's re-election strategy, and damn the torpedoes, regardless of what oil price is.
All right, let's look at the opposition leader now. We're Tom Mulcair. We're talking about Tom Mulcair before Justin Trudeau.
That's
Louise.
You get a tap on the back for that.
Yeah, right. Louise, what do you think the opposition leader needs to work on, or what could the year ahead look like for him?
Well, as we've kind of mentioned, he has to register. He doesn't register right now with voters outside of Quebec. Quebec, he is a household name because he was a cabinet minister there provincially, but he really needs to do his best to get known. It's not enough, unfortunately, and I hate to say this, it's not enough to perform well in question period. It's not enough to be a diligent leader of the opposition. I think Susan's right. Part of what he could do is adopt better, more clear policies on things that, really the Liberals have ceded a lot of ground here. So he could definitely fill that vacuum and make himself more noticed. It's a riskier strategy than presenting your policies in an election campaign, but for him, he has nothing to lose at this point because he's the lowest in the polls and it's a significant deficit.
Except in Quebec, Marty. So what is it in Quebec that Tom Mulcair is doing right that, I don't know, that he could try and replicate elsewhere?
He's he's running on Jack Layton's legacy to a certain extent, as has been pointed out. Of course, he was a former cabinet minister, and also he's a lefty leader. He's seen as a lefty leader, pure lefty, that isn't the Bloc Québécois, which the Quebecers got quite tired of. And transposing that on the rest of the country is a mug's game. I don't know if it's even possible. The thing, if I can for a second, is put Trudeau and Mulcair in the same boat, because that's exactly what Harper's going to do. The two parties have to figure out a way. I'm not going to say they're going to have a twin strategy, because they won't, and that's probably part of the problem, but a way to differentiate each other and not split that progressive vote, because that is exactly what Harper's going to be doing. It happened in 2011 and got them a majority in Ontario.
And Susan, let's move to Trudeau if we could. You can get a little in Mulcair there if you want.
No, I just want to get a little on Harper. To quote one of his favorite composers, Lennon and McCartney, money can't buy you love. So I do not think those baby bonus checks necessarily are going to seal his fate. Now, on Trudeau, my advice to Trudeau would be stay bold. In fact, get bolder. Do things that shock the bourgeois, that shock the press gallery. Kick senators out of the Liberal caucus, and take firm stance on things like the sexual. I agree with Louise. He looked good on that sexual harassment thing. I think he's capable of taking bold stands, and I think it looks good on him.
I think, just quickly, I call those policy bombs. That's what Trudeau's going to do. He's very good at policy bombs. And stop making jokes.
All right. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Especially about serious international affairs, right?
On the fit.
Okay, so the big story, what do you think will be the driving issue? This is very quick. The driving issue for 2015. Louise.
Well, it's going to be the election, if you can call that an issue. That's going to be the lens through which everything is viewed. As I mentioned earlier, I think oil prices could play a role. Not because I think that could mean the government won't meet its promises. It's going to meet those promises. I agree with Marty on that. But I would say that they may have to pay for those promises differently, because they're also going to have to balance the books. So that's going to be a game changer if it continues.
Susan.
Military procurement is probably going to come back to haunt us. How many of those F-35s is the government going to buy, if any? Are we going to buy any ships for the Navy or continue to kind of rent them out? I think that they've got a big problem there that it's going to consume a lot of airtime.
Marty?
Price of oil and ISIS mission, the mission against ISIS. The success of the latter and the increase of the former are key part and parcel for Mr. Harper to get reelected.
Thank you all very much. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year, and all that stuff. We'll be back in the new year, but thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.
Nicely done.
Happy holidays.
All right, that is Susan Riley, Louise Elliott in Ottawa, and Martin Patrick in Montreal. At any time, if you want to join the conversation, send me a tweet at AndrewCBC, and we'll be sharing some of your thoughts a little later. Remember, you can catch up with the Sunday Scrum online. Just go to cbcnews.ca and find the politics page.